Okay, we've been studying Leviticus. Last week we spent a lot of time talking about leprosy. I want to start with kind of the summation from last week, Leviticus 13, verses 45 and 46. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. We talked a lot about this, and one of the things that I wanted to go back and touch one more time in case somebody wasn't here or missed it, and that was that leprosy, the word we use is leprosy, and what we think of when we say the term leprosy is Hansen's disease. That's where the skin falls off. You may lose limbs and things like this. But the term in Hebrew that is eventually translated leprosy, to the Hebrews meant something else. It was more of a class of diseases than a specific disease. And it was everything, or not, I'm not going to say everything, it was from things as minor as psoriasis, or eczema, all the way up into some very serious diseases. Whether leprosy was, as we understand it, was one of these diseases or not is questionable, because the diagnosis that they put in the Bible leaves out a majority of the major symptoms of leprosy. However, some of the early symptoms of leprosy do match some of those. So it's questionable whether that was covered. It was a very rare disease during this time period in the Middle East. Now, having said that, we automatically think, well, they had leper colonies. Yeah, they had colonies of people with skin diseases. It was not necessarily leprosy as we understand it today. So there was a variety of things, and I spent a lot of time last week trying to emphasize the fact that this was not something that was a rare thing for the Hebrews. This was something that happened a lot, whereas leprosy was actually fairly rare. So I don't want to overemphasize that to the point to where there were not serious diseases, because there were. And one of the key things, if you read, not always, but didn't have to be there, but one of the things that almost always signified that this was sarat, or something like that, which was the Hebrew word, was that it was growing. It was spreading. Now, it didn't always have to be spreading. For instance, a raw wound or a raw boil or something of that didn't have to be spreading to be classed as this. But if it was spreading, that was a good sign that this would be classified in this set of diseases. Now, I go through all of that for two reasons. One, because I want us to understand what they were doing, and this was not just a rare thing. It was something that happened, that the sacrifices that went along with it, that the rituals that we talked about were not uncommon. So much like everything else we have talked about in this section of holiness is a constant thing in their lives. So today I want us to start in chapter 13, verse 47. We're leaving the section where it talks about a leprous person. And in verse 47, it starts out, when there is a case of a leprous disease, many versions say a plague of leprosy, in a garment. And so when we think of that, or at least when I thought of it, the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, somebody that has had leprosy has been wearing this shirt, and some of the leprosy has gotten on the shirt, so it's contaminated by a virus or a bacteria or something like that. But that's not what it's talking about. Once again, this is a class of diseases, or disease may not actually be the right term, because in this case, it appears it's talking about mold mildew and fungus type things. We're going to look at it and you'll see the types of things that it's talking about. But once again, those are growing things. So we see a concept to the Hebrews of you have something normal, whether it be a body or a garment, and something growing on it that is abnormal. And we talked last week a little bit about a spot and a blemish, such as in the lambs, we're supposed to be spotless, without blemish. So we see this concept in their heads. So as we go on, it says, when there is a case of leprous disease in a garment, whether a woolen or a linen garment, or in warp or woof of linen or wool, or in a skin or anything made of skin. So we have three things here. We have linen, we have wool. What's the difference between linen and wool? Source. Linen was considered to be made of flax or a plant, where wool came from, we think of wool being specifically from sheep, but it's from any animal's hair, really, is the classification there. And the third one was leather or skin. Now, we think of skin, we think of our skin, but when it says skin here, it's talking about leather from the animals. So it was something that was tanned. So we have those three classes, and you're going to see in this section, it keeps coming back and saying warp and woof, warp and woof. What is warp and woof? Does anybody know? Warp and woof of linen and wool. It's talking, when you weave something, you have threads going different way. Warp and woof is that weave. Warp and woof. I don't know if it's warp and woof or warp and woof, but it's the weave. So when it's saying this, it's being not only on the garment itself, but even in the very threads is the emphasis being here. Doesn't matter if it's on the garment or even just on a little bit of a thread. So that, and then of course, if it's made of skin of an animal, it's a garment. Now, was there anything else that they wore as garments in this time frame? If there was, I don't know. I guess you could have a straw hat or palm leaves or something like that, but not as a garment, really. Okay, so verse 49, and this is where we start seeing the conjunction to be kind of where the diagnosis, where it makes it look like it's mold or mildew or fungus or something like this growing. If the disease is greenish or reddish in the garment, or in the skin of the skin, or in the warp or the wool of any article made of skin, let me back up and try this again. If the disease is greenish or reddish in the garment, or in the skin, or in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, it is a case of leprous disease, and it shall be shown to the priest. And the priest shall examine the disease and shut up that which has the disease for 7 days. Then he shall examine the disease on the 7th day. If the disease has spread in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in the skin, or whatever be the use of the skin, the disease is a persistent leprous disease, it is unclean. And he shall burn the garment, or the warp, or the woof, the wool, or the linen, or any article made of skin that is diseased. For it is a persistent leprous disease. It shall be burned in the fire. So we see that if it's declared leprous in this section, where it's growing, notice the thing is that it is spread, then that article is considered disease and is destroyed by fire. Now, we can make a lot of allusions to why it was by fire and different things. But this is what God said for them to do. Real quick, let me look at my notes. Okay, and we continue in verse 53. And if the priest examines, and if the disease has not spread in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of the skin, then the priest shall command they wash the thing in which is the disease, and he shall shut it up for another 7 days. So, okay, let's get this in our mind. Somebody has something that looks funky. Let's just use that term for lack of a. You can imagine that these people pretty much knew what they were looking for. Okay, we're coming at it from a little different perspective. When we think of clean clothing, we think whether it was washed or dry cleaned or something like that. They're thinking of clean as in clean from a ritual standpoint, something that could make them unclean, that could make them not in a whole relationship with God. So if it comes in, they shut it up for 7 days, it's growing, it's destroyed. If it's not growing, if it hasn't spread, then the priest tells them to wash it. And they shut it up for another 7 days to look at it again. Now, this may seem a little strange to us for a lot of reasons, but how many pairs of clothes did they have? Did they have a closet full? No. Okay? We're going to look at that a little bit later too, something else. Verse 55, and the priest shall examine the thing after it's been shut up a second 7 days, after it has been washed, and if the appearance of the diseased area has not changed, though the disease has not spread, it is unclean. You shall burn it in fire, whether the rod is on the front or on the back. Now, what would be the point of saying whether it's on the front or the back? We are in chapter 13. 13. Sorry about that. Well, you think of people for a minute. People that don't have clothes like we have, where we have one shirt that's stained and we can't get it out, we'll put it back for use when we're not meeting other people or something like that. So if it's only stained on the back side, then people couldn't see it. But if it's only stained on the front, then it couldn't touch them and make them unclean, right? Well, no, that's what he's saying, is doesn't matter where it is. If it's growing or if it hasn't, if it's unclean, doesn't matter where the uncleanness is, it's unclean. Okay, so verse 56. But if the priest examines and the diseased area has faded after it has been washed, he shall tear it out of the garment or the skin or the warp or the woof. So what's this concept of tearing it out? What are they going to do? They'll remove the diseased area, so what are they going to do after that? They'll mend it, they'll patch it, do whatever. So that's the concept of tearing it out. They're tearing out the diseased area, but only if it's faded. In other words, they're not classifying the garment as unclean, but they're saying, let's get rid of this diseased spot or this spot because we want it to be without spot or blemish is the concept that we're seeing here. So, verse 57, and if it appears again in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, it is spreading. You shall burn with fire whatever has the disease. So, once again, anything that has the disease is considered unclean, and they're going to get rid of it by fire. Now, when I read this and think about it, the first thing I think about moving it into a spiritual realm is what is fire? What do we think of when we think of fire as getting rid of sin or something like that? We think of hell. Yeah, it's going to be destroyed. So we see this type of a concept here, and whether that's exactly what it's foreshadowing, we don't know, but that's what comes to my mind. 58, but the garment or the warp or the woof or any article made of skin from which the disease departs, when you have washed it, shall be washed a second time, and it shall be clean. Ain't get much plainer than that. So they take it before the priest. He says, yeah, that looks funky. That looks like it might be a problem. It's red or green, it's spreading. We're going to shut it up 7 days. Comes back, it's not spreading. We're going to wash it. Shut it up 7 days. Has it faded? Yeah, okay. So tear it out. If it doesn't grow back, it's clean. You can keep using the shirt or pants or whatever it was. And then verse 59, this is the law of the case for the leprous disease of the garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, to determine whether it's clean or unclean. And that's the point here. The whole point of this was to see if the garment was clean or unclean. Now, we've asked several times what these holiness laws were about, and we keep coming up. One of the things was they tended to put the Hebrews at a higher plane in the health region, what they ate, how they treated illnesses, how they dealt with contagious disease and things like that. And that makes sense. But that's our interpretation. We don't know that was the main purpose of what God was doing, and I really don't think it was. I think the main purpose here had to do more with them being able to live with God in their midst. And that's an important part of what all of this is about. So they could understand what they had to do so that they would be in a position to live with God. Yes, sir.
Even to make it more concise, most of this has to do with a symbolism of sin, being unclean, and as compared to being in other words, living according to God's, all these laws and specifics and all that. If you didn't do that, if you ignored these and said, I'm not going to go see the priest, that would be completely sinful. You're not living a godly life in obedience to the Lord. No, this, like leprosy, was that not a symbol of sin?
Yes and no. We can look at it and see that, yes, we can see how it could represent sin. But once again, notice they didn't do anything to get it. So I want to be careful about that. But how they responded to it could be, like you're saying, and it's the separation, holiness, being separate is the concept here. And you're either separated to God, being holy, or separated from God, being common or profane or unholy.
And having this being part of the law was not going to be completely obeyed. It was going to show the Israelites that they were basically unholy unless they follow God's law and lean on Him. No.
Yes and no. I think you're right in a large sense. One of the things that we see is the children of Israel, as we look at all these things, the things you can eat, the things you can drink, the things you can touch, your garments, and we'll go on with other things today. But how could they live without coming in contact with some of that? And they couldn't. That's part of the point. God gave them a way to remedy that. And I think that's part of the reason for all of this. This was how they could live with God in their midst. They're going to encounter this. They're going to have diseases. They couldn't help but to touch dead people when they died because they had to bury them.
My point is if they ignore these.
If they didn't do this, then they could not be made clean again. Yes.
Even more rebellious nation if they said, you know what, this stuff's ridiculous. Let's just follow the cloud and go on.
I haven't ever heard it put that way, but yes, if they rejected what God told them to do, that is absolutely a sin.
Yeah, because the other nations, they didn't have anything like that.
That's a big point. They're being made different from the other nations. So were you raising your hand or just scratching? Okay, I just saw it out of the corner of my eye. So that's one of the big emphasis points here. So yes.
And just as a reminder, many of these are general, like health rules. You know, they didn't have a government that instituted wearing masks and getting vaccinations
it had that effect, whether it was the main purpose or not. It did have that effect, yes. And turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 29 for just a second. I want you to think about this because we're talking about their garments in the wilderness. Now, chapter 29 is a really cool chapter. Moses is talking to the children of Israel, and it starts out, in fact, I wasn't planning on reading it, but I'm going to. Starting in verse 2, Moses summed all of Israel and said to them, "You have seen that all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants, to all his land, and the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs, and those great wonders. But to this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn out on your feet." Now, you can go ahead and read the whole speech. It's a great speech. But the concept here is Moses is saying, look, you've seen all this, and you still ain't got it yet. Okay? But the reason I bring this up is, okay, they're talking about garments here. We don't believe they had a lot of garments anyway, because their garments didn't wear out for 40 years. Think about that for a minute. Can you imagine not ever having to buy new clothes? Unless you got a disease in your clothes or something. And yet they didn't see it. They didn't hear it. And we can relate to that directly and look at what Christ has given us. And sometimes we just kind of push it off. Yes, sir.
But it's not a lot to deal with, not only the obedience of God, but the promise of God as well.
The what?
The promise.
Yes. Yeah. Not only the providence, but his direct action in making sure they could live with him. I think that's important. Yes, his providence is there. He's taking care of them more than just with providence here, though. He's doing direct things to take care of it. Okay, so now, after this little section of garments, we're going back to lepers. And as we go back to lepers, what it's going to talk about is when they're healed. Now, remember, somebody that has come up, and I keep using my arm because it's easy to point to and do this number on. But they've come up with a spot. They've come up with a growth. They've been declared leprous. They live outside the camp alone until the disease has been healed. And many of them did heal by themselves. And so after it's healed, this is what happens. The important part here is they're doing is not healing the disease. This is what happens after they are healed. Okay? So Leviticus chapter 14, verses 1 through 9. The Lord said to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing," or many versions say, on the day at the time of his cleansing. "He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look." So he's going to be brought to the priest, but he makes a special point of saying the priest is going to go outside of the camp to see him. So he's still out in the camp. He's, by definition, by himself. He may be with other lepers, other people that have diseases type outside the camp. But he's in essence by himself to a certain degree. Then the case of the leprous disease healed, if the case of the leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be clean 2 live clean birds and cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. Many versions say running water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over fresh water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who's to be cleansed of the leprous disease, and he shall pronounce him clean. And shall let the living bird go into the open field. And he is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes and shave off all his hair and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent 7 days. And on the 7th day he shall shave off all his hair from his head, his beard, his eyebrows. He shall shave off all of his hair. And then he shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean. So the first step here, and I want you to think about somebody, whether they've been outside the camp for 3 days, a week, a month, 10 years, however long. When they go out, they don't know how long they're going to be out there. You can imagine them checking every day to see, is it getting better? Is it healed? And it looks good. They go to the priest evidently comes out. I don't know if he came out regularly or somehow they had somebody have him come out, but he came out to the camp, and he would go to the priest would look at it and see that it was healed. So if it's healed, he commands them to bring them 2 live birds. In this case, live is often is translated wild. It's 2 birds. We assume they were clean birds. Cedar wood, a scarlet thread, and hyssop. Anybody have a clue what cedar wood, scarlet thread, and hyssop reminds you of, or is why he specifies that? Do you remember any other place that hyssop is used? What? At the cross? Okay. Yes, what is hyssop, by the way? It's a bushy, fibrous, yes. They used it to sprinkle blood. Where else did they use it?
They used it for the covenant, making the covenant with God, and then also for the Passover.
They also used it on the lintels when they were leaving Egypt. So this was something that was used a lot. Cedar was considered a very strong, special wood. Yeah, we like it because of the odor. It cleans the air. And what about the scarlet thread? In my mind, what I see, knowing some of the things y'all have mentioned about the different things that these were used for, you have a piece of cedar wood, some hyssop, and the string ties it to the... That's the picture I get in my head. Whether that's actually true or not, I don't know. I don't know the semblance of all of this, other than the fact this is what they did in many rituals. It was the type of things used when they were sprinkling the blood for many cleansings, for quite a few things anyway. So it's just what it was. So we see this picture of this person outside the camp. They're healed, and now the priest says you're clean. And they get to go back in the camp. So it's almost as if this first part is almost a private ceremony. It probably wasn't private, no one around, but they bathed and this type of thing. So there's part of it there. But now they get to go back in the camp. But they can't go into their tent. They don't go into the tabernacle. And the next verse says, and on the 8th day. So verse 10. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, and 1 ewe lamb, a year old without blemish, and a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, and 1 log of oil, log being a measurement. And the priest who cleanses him shall shout the man who is to be cleansed, and these things before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So he's now going inside the court. He's before the tabernacle itself. Okay? And the priest shall take 1 of the male lambs and offer it for a guilt offering, along with the log of oil, and wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. And he shall kill the lamb in the place where they kill the sin offering and the burnt offering, in the place of the sanctuary. For the guilt offering, like the sin offering, belongs to the priest. I'm going to stop there. These two offerings were offerings where the priest got part of the offering, and so that's what that's referring to when it says it belongs to the priest. It is most holy. I lost my place when I moved. 14. Well, I had to find it. That's the problem. And the priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and the big toe of his right foot. Now, does that remind you of anything?
The priest's consecration.
When they consecrated the priest. So this is symbolic of him being reconsecrated to God as a child of Israel, as a covenant relationship with God. That's what we're seeing here. And the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed, and the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. The priest shall offer the sin offering to make atonement for him who is to be cleansed of his uncleanness, and afterward he shall kill the burnt offering. And the priest shall offer the burnt offering and the grain offering offered on the altar. Thus shall the priest make atonement for him to be clean. The next section we're not going to read, but simply talks about if he doesn't have the means wherewith to have the 3 lambs, then he can use it for someone less with less means, then he would use birds and other things we see. I think there's anyway. So that's the concept here. So what we're seeing here is 4 offerings. 4 of the 5 offerings that we studied at the very beginning. We have the sin offering, the guilt offering, the burnt offering, and the grain offering. So this is a big deal. The only offering that is not commanded here is the peace offering. And that was generally considered a voluntary offering, not in all cases, but most cases. So that's the picture of someone. Can you imagine how that person felt after they go through this ritual or as they're going through this ritual? It's almost like their life has been torn away from them. And now they're back. They're back with the people they love. They're back in a relationship with God. This is I can just imagine people crying in happiness. It's just one of those pictures that's really good.
Okay. So, are we to understand that earlier I talked about symbolism of sin, and now we're here where we're offering these sacrifices for atonement. So is that just atonement for having an illness?
Well, I'm going to touch this real briefly, and then hopefully I'm going to try to get to it today. We're going to go through the next couple of sections real fast. But we see that the atonement, a lot of cases the offerings were made, for instance, the sin offering was kind of like, okay, it's like I have defiled some of the things of God. Do you remember that class? That's what that was for. That was to cleanse those things. Now, atonement, we're going to study next week. So I don't want to go too deep into that right now. But yes, there is a question there, and we're going to touch on part of your question there in just a minute. So Leviticus 14:33 through 54 starts out, and we're not going to look at this real deeply here, but it starts out saying, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron saying, when you come into the land of Canaan, so this is when they take the land of Canaan, he's going to give them the people's houses that are there. And this is the law that has to do with finding a leprous disease in the house. And it's pretty much the same as the garment. You have, the priest comes in, shuts it up for 7 days, looks to see if it's grown. If it has, they tear out the wall where it is, the plaster and everything, and redo it and shut it up again. And if it grows again, they tear the whole building down, throw it to an unclean place outside the house. So, I can see them saying, we're living in tents. What does this have to do with us? Stone houses. Well, it had to do with what was coming. And God's making a way for them. And whether it had to do with health and the cleanliness, it had definitely to do with their holiness to God. Being separated to God and being able to come before Him. And I can't emphasize this enough. They were very careful about how they came before God. If it was clean after they had redone it, they did essentially the same thing we just talked about. They took 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet thread, hyssop, killed over running water, and we'll go on. Now, one of the things that I did mention before that I meant to was that the 2 birds, very much like the 2 lambs in the Passover, which we will get to next week. So just keep that in your head. Chapter 15, we've got about 7 minutes, and I'm going to go through this. We're not going to read it. This is a little bit of a uncomfortable topic for me in a public speaking. But having said that, it's there. It is some, especially newer versions, are using terms that are more specific, but the general terms are being used in the Hebrew. And it's talking about genital discharges. And much as Zach has talked about several times in Hebrew writing, there's an order. 1A, 1B, C, 2B, 1A. It's kind of an emphasis. It's a way of writing. So we see that, and this is the way it does it. It talks about 5 things. Abnormal, long-term male discharges, normal, short-term male discharges, intercourse, normal, short-term female discharges, and abnormal, long-term female discharges. That's what it talks about. And it talks about all of those. Every one of the 5 made them unclean for some period of time. For the long-term male, 7 days of cleaning. They would bathe and wash their clothes. 2 birds, assuming turtle doves or pigeon. Burnt offering, sin offering was offered. That was what happened. So if a man had a long-term disease, then once it was over, once he was healed, he would make those offerings and be clean. For a short term, it wasn't necessarily even a disease, it was just a discharge. Then he was unclean until evening, and he bathed and washed his clothes. With intercourse, both were required to bathe. They would both be unclean until evening, and once again, evening being the beginning of the next day, or so for the rest of the day. Short term for female, they would be unclean 7 days, and any person that came in contact with them or anything they sat on or whatever, and this is the same type thing for the male as well. But with the female, anyone that came in contact with them were unclean for 7 days, and there was no rite for the female, but the male did have a rite for cleansing. For the female long term, and when you think of this, you think of the lady that had the issue of blood for 12 years from the New Testament. That's a good example of this. Once they're healed, it's the same as the male with the long term, which was they would have 7 days of cleansing, they would bathe and wash their clothes, they would offer 2 birds. And then they were clean. Now, the importance of this and the interesting thing to me of this is the fact that this is part of the holiness. Now, they can't go through life doing the things they're commanded to do and not have some of these normal things happen to them. If they're married, they're blessed, they're going to have intercourse. That's part of it. So Why is this making them unclean? Why is this here? And I think it comes back in one part to the concept that God is making them separate. You see, for the pagan rituals, they had temple prostitutes was a normal thing. This was something they did. God said, no, that's not part of your worship to me. That's not what I want you to do. I want you to come to me with, me on your mind. I want you to come to me. I am your God. And that's the visual I see from this. Now turn to Leviticus 15, verse 31. And this should, while this is summing up this section, I think it sums up the entire thing we've been talking about here for this whole section. It says, thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. So that's what you were asking about. That's what this is about. He says, I want you to be separate. I want you to separate you from your uncleanness. Hey, you're going to live in it. And this sounds to me so much like being in the world but not of the world in the New Testament. So he says, I want you to be separate from, I want you to stand out so that you will not die in your sins by defiling my tabernacle that is in your midst. Now move that to us today. Where's the tabernacle of God? We are. How do we defile this tabernacle today? Okay, I was thinking more of how we did it, but that's what does it, yes. We do many different things that can defile it. And I think it's important. This helps us see the importance of following the things to be made clean, to being made clean, to being clean, so that we can not only live with God in our midst, but live with God in us. Next week, we're going to study the central portion of this book. It's on atonement. I recommend you read the chapter 16 multiple times this week in preparation. Thank you for your comments and your attention.